Part 2 of Chapter 9 of Aviation Instructor's Handbook by the FAA. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Situational Awareness. Situational awareness is the accurate perception and understanding of all the factors and conditions within the four fundamental risk elements that affect safety before, during, and after the flight. Maintaining situational awareness requires an understanding of the relative significance of these factors and their future impact on the flight. When situationally aware, the pilot has an overview of the total operation and is not fixated on one perceived significant factor. Some of the elements inside the aircraft to be considered are the status of the aircraft systems, pilot, and passengers. In addition, an awareness of the environmental conditions of the flight, such as spatial orientation of the aircraft and its relationship to terrain, traffic, weather, and airspace, must be maintained. To maintain situational awareness, all of the skills involved in ADM are used. For example, an accurate perception of the pilot's fitness can be achieved through self-assessment and recognition of hazardous attitudes. A clear assessment of the status of navigation equipment can be obtained through workload management, and establishing a productive relationship with ATC can be accomplished by effective resource use. Obstacles to maintaining situational awareness. Many obstacles exist that can interfere with a pilot's ability to maintain situational awareness. For example, fatigue, stress, or work overload can cause the pilot to fixate on a single perceived important item rather than maintaining an overall awareness of the flight situation. A contributing factor in many accidents is a distraction, which diverts the pilot's attention from monitoring the instruments or scanning outside the aircraft. Many flight deck distractions begin as a minor problem, such as a gauge that is not reading correctly, but result in accidents as the pilot diverts attention to the perceived problem and neglects to properly control the aircraft. Fatigue, discussed as an obstacle to learning, is also an obstacle to maintaining situational awareness. It is a threat to aviation safety because it impairs alertness and performance. Figure 9-5. The term is used to describe a range of experiences from sleepy or tired to exhausted. Two major physiological phenomena create fatigue: sleep loss and circadian rhythm disruption. Fatigue is a normal response to many conditions common to flight operations because characteristics of the flight deck environment, such as low barometric pressure, humidity, noise, and vibration, make pilots susceptible to fatigue. The only effective treatment for fatigue is adequate sleep. As fatigue progresses, it is responsible for increased errors of omission, followed by errors of commission, and microsleeps, or involuntary sleep lapses lasting from a few seconds to a few minutes. For obvious reasons, errors caused by these short absences can have significant hazardous consequences in the aviation environment. Sleep-deprived pilots may not notice sleepiness or other fatigue symptoms during pre-flight and departure flight operations. Once underway and established on altitude and heading, sleepiness and other fatigue symptoms tend to manifest themselves. Extreme fatigue can cause uncontrolled and involuntary shutdown of the brain. Regardless of motivation, professionalism, or training, an individual who is extremely sleepy can lapse into sleep at any time, despite the potential consequences of inattention. There are a number of countermeasures for coping with fatigue, as shown in Figure 9-6. Figure 9-6, text. Countermeasures for coping with fatigue. Long naps, 3 to 4 hours, can restore alertness for 12 to 15 hours. Short power naps, 10 to 30 minutes, restore alertness for 3 to 4 hours. Eat high-protein meals. Drink plenty of fluids, especially water. Rotate flight tasks and converse with other crew members or passengers. Keep the flight deck temperature cool. Move/stretch in the seat, and periodically get up to walk around the aircraft if possible. Note, allow 15 to 20 minutes after awakening to become fully alert before assuming aircrew duties. End of Figure 9-6 text. Complacency presents another obstacle to maintaining situational awareness. Defined as overconfidence from repeated experience on a specific activity, complacency has been implicated as a contributing factor in numerous aviation accidents and incidents. Like fatigue, complacency reduces the pilot's effectiveness in the flight deck. However, complacency is harder to recognize than fatigue, since everything is perceived to be progressing smoothly. Highly reliable automation has been shown to induce overconfidence and complacency. This can result in a pilot following the instructions of the automation even when common sense suggests otherwise. If the pilot assumes the autopilot is doing its job, he or she does not cross-check the instruments or the aircraft's position frequently. If the autopilot fails, the pilot may not be mentally prepared to fly the aircraft manually. Instructors should be especially alert to complacency in students with significant flight experience. For example, a pilot receiving a flight review in a familiar aircraft may be prone to complacency. Advanced avionics have created a high degree of redundancy and dependability in modern aircraft systems, which can promote complacency and inattention. During flight training, the CFI should emphasize that flight operations may lead to a sense of complacency, which can threaten flight safety by reducing situational awareness. By asking about positions of other aircraft in the traffic pattern, engine instrument indications, and the aircraft's location in relation to references on a chart, the instructor can determine if the student is maintaining situational awareness. The instructor can also attempt to focus the student's attention on an imaginary problem with the communication or navigation equipment. The instructor should point out that situational awareness is not being maintained if the student diverts too much attention away from other tasks, such as controlling the aircraft or scanning for traffic. These are simple exercises that can be done throughout flight training, which help emphasize the importance of maintaining situational awareness. Operational pitfalls. There are numerous classic behavioral traps that can ensnare the unwary pilot. Pilots, particularly those with considerable experience, try to complete a flight as planned, please passengers, and meet schedules. This basic drive to demonstrate achievements can have an adverse effect on safety and can impose an unrealistic assessment of piloting skills under stressful conditions. These tendencies ultimately may bring about practices that are dangerous and sometimes illegal, and may lead to a mishap. Students develop awareness and learn to avoid many of the operational pitfalls through effective ADM training. The scenarios and examples provided by instructors during ADM instruction should involve these pitfalls. Figure 9-7. Single Pilot Resource Management, SRM. Single Pilot Resource Management, SRM, is defined as the art and science of managing all the resources, both on board the aircraft and from outside sources, available to a single pilot prior to and during flight to ensure the successful outcome of the flight. SRM includes the concepts of ADM, Risk Management, RM, Task Management, TM, Automation Management, AM, Controlled Flight into Terrain, CFIT, awareness, and Situational Awareness, SA. SRM training helps the pilot maintain situational awareness by managing the automation and associated aircraft control and navigation tasks. This enables the pilot to accurately assess and manage risk and make accurate and timely decisions. SRM is all about helping pilots learn how to gather information, analyze it, and make decisions. Although the flight is coordinated by a single person and not an onboard flight crew, the use of available resources such as air traffic control, ATC, and automated flight service station, AFSS, replicates the principles of CRM. SRM and the 5P check. SRM is about gathering information, analyzing it, and making decisions. Learning how to identify problems, analyze the information, and make informed and timely decisions is not as straightforward as the training involved in learning specific maneuvers. Learning how to judge a situation and how to think in the endless variety of situations encountered while flying out in the real world is more difficult. There is no one right answer to ADM. Rather, each pilot is expected to analyze each situation in light of experience level, personal minimums, and current physical and mental readiness level, and make his or her own decision. SRM sounds good on paper, but it requires a way for pilots to understand and use it in their daily flights. One practical application is called the 5 Ps, Figure 9-8. The 5 Ps consist of the plan, the plane, the pilot, the passengers, and the programming. Each of these areas consists of a set of challenges and opportunities that face a single pilot, and each can substantially increase or decrease the risk of successfully completing the flight based on the pilot's ability to make informed and timely decisions. The 5 Ps are used to evaluate the pilot's current situation at key decision points during the flight, or when an emergency arises. These decision points include pre-flight, pre-takeoff, hourly or at the midpoint of the flight, pre-descent, and just prior to the final approach fix, or for visual flight rules, VFR operations, just prior to entering the traffic pattern. The 5 Ps are based on the idea that the pilot has essentially 5 variables that impact his or her environment and that can cause the pilot to make a single critical decision, or several less critical decisions, that when added together can create a critical outcome. This concept stems from the belief that current decision-making models tend to be reactionary in nature. A change must occur and be detected to drive a risk management decision by the pilot. For instance, many pilots use risk management sheets that are filled out by the pilot prior to takeoff. These form a catalog of risks that may be encountered that day and turn them into numerical values. If the total exceeds a certain level, the flight is altered or canceled. Informal research shows that while these are useful documents for teaching risk factors, they are almost never used outside of formal training programs. The 5P concept is an attempt to take the information contained in those sheets and in other available models and use it. The 5P concept relies on the pilot to adopt a scheduled review of the critical variables at points in the flight where decisions are most likely to be effective. For instance, the easiest point to cancel a flight due to bad weather is before the pilot and passengers walk out the door to load the aircraft. So the first decision point is pre-flight in the flight planning room, where all the information is readily available to make a sound decision, and where communication and fixed-based operator FBO services are readily available to make alternate travel plans. The second easiest point in the flight to make a critical safety decision is just prior to takeoff. Few pilots have ever had an emergency takeoff. While the point of the 5P check is to help the pilot fly, the correct application of the 5P before takeoff is to assist in making a reasoned go, no-go decision based on all the information available. These 2 points in the process of flying are critical go, no-go points in each and every flight. The third place to review the 5 Ps is at the midpoint of the flight. Often, pilots may wait until the Automated Terminal Information Service, ATIS, is in range to check weather. Yet, at this point in the flight, many good options have already passed behind the aircraft and pilot. Additionally, fatigue and low-altitude hypoxia serve to rob the pilot of much of his or her energy by the end of a long and tiring flight day. This leads to a transition from a decision-making mode to an acceptance mode on the part of the pilot. If the flight is longer than 2 hours, the 5P check should be conducted hourly. The last 2 decision points are just prior to descent into the terminal area and just prior to the final approach fix, or, if VFR, just prior to entering the traffic pattern, as preparations for landing commence. Most pilots execute approaches with the expectation they will land out of the approach every time. A healthier attitude requires the pilot to assume that changing conditions, the 5 Ps again, will cause the pilot to divert or execute the missed approach on every approach. This keeps the pilot alert to all conditions that may increase risk and threaten the safe conduct of the flight. Diverting from cruise altitude saves fuel, allows unhurried use of the autopilot, and is less reactive in nature. Diverting from the final approach fix, while more difficult, still allows the pilot to plan and coordinate better rather than executing a futile missed approach. Let's look at a detailed discussion of each of the 5 Ps. The plan. The plan can also be called the mission or the task. It contains the basic elements of cross-country planning: weather, route, fuel, publications currency, etc. The plan should be reviewed and updated several times during the course of the flight. A delayed takeoff due to maintenance, fast-moving weather, and a short-notice temporary flight restriction, TFR, may all radically alter the plan. The plan is not only about the flight plan, but also all the events that surround the flight and allow the pilot to accomplish the mission. The plan is always being updated and modified and is especially responsive to changes in the other 4 remaining Ps. If for no other reason, the 5P check reminds the pilot that the day's flight plan is real life and subject to change at any time. Obviously, weather is a huge part of any plan. The addition of real-time data link weather information give the advanced avionics pilot a real advantage in inclement weather, but only if the pilot is trained to retrieve and evaluate the weather in real time without sacrificing situational awareness. And of course, weather information should drive a decision, even if that decision is to continue on the current plan. Pilots of aircraft without data link weather should get updated weather in flight through an AFSS and/or Flight Watch. The plane. Both the plan and the plane are fairly familiar to most pilots. The plane consists of the usual array of mechanical and cosmetic issues that every aircraft pilot, owner, or operator can identify. With the advent of advanced avionics, the plane has expanded to include database currency, automation status, and emergency backup systems that were unknown a few years ago. Much has been written about single-pilot IFR flight, both with and without an autopilot. While this is a personal decision, it is just that, a decision. Low IFR in a non-autopilot equipped aircraft may depend on several of the other Ps to be discussed. Pilot proficiency, currency, and fatigue are among them. The pilot. Flying, especially when used for business transportation, can expose the pilot to high-altitude flying, long distance and endurance, and more challenging weather. An advanced avionics aircraft, simply due to its advanced capabilities, can expose a pilot to even more of these stresses. The traditional "I'm safe" checklist is a good start. The combination of late night, pilot fatigue, and the effects of sustained flight above 5,000 feet may cause pilots to become less discerning, less critical of information, less decisive, and more compliant and accepting. Just as the most critical portion of the flight approaches, for instance, a night instrument approach in the weather after a 4-hour flight, the pilot's guard is down the most. The 5P process helps a pilot recognize the physiological situation at the end of the flight before takeoff, and continues to update personal conditions as the flight progresses. Once risks are identified, the pilot is in an infinitely better place to make alternate plans that lessen the effect of these factors and provide a safer solution. The passengers. One of the key differences between CRM and SRM is the way passengers interact with the pilot. The pilot of a high-capability single-engine aircraft has entered into a very personal relationship with the passengers. In fact, the pilot and passengers sit within an arm's reach all of the time. The desire of the passengers to make airline connections or important business meetings enters easily into this pilot's decision-making loop. Done in a healthy and open way, this can be a positive factor. Consider a flight to Dulles Airport, and the passengers, both close friends and business partners, need to get to Washington, D.C. for an important meeting. The weather is VFR all the way to Southern Virginia, then turns to low IFR as the pilot approaches Dulles. A pilot employing the 5P approach might consider reserving a rental car at an airport in northern North Carolina or southern Virginia to coincide with a refueling stop. Thus, the passengers have a way to get to Washington, and the pilot has an out to avoid being pressured into continuing the flight if the conditions do not improve. Passengers can also be pilots. If no one is designated as pilot in command, PIC, and unplanned circumstances arise, the decision-making styles of several self-confident pilots may conflict. Pilots also need to understand that non-pilots may not understand the level of risk involved in the flight. There is an element of risk in every flight. That is why SRM calls it risk management, not risk elimination. While a pilot may feel comfortable with the risk present in a night IFR flight, the passengers may not. A pilot employing SRM should ensure the passengers are involved in the decision-making and given tasks and duties to keep them busy and involved. If, upon a factual description of the risks present, the passengers decide to buy an airline ticket or rent a car, then a good decision has generally been made. This discussion also allows the pilot to move past what he or she thinks the passengers want to do and find out what they actually want to do. This removes self-induced pressure from the pilot. The programming. The advanced avionics aircraft adds an entirely new dimension to the way general aviation aircraft are flown. The electronic instrument displays, GPS, and autopilot reduce pilot workload and increase pilot situational awareness. While programming and operation of these devices are fairly simple and straightforward, unlike the analog instruments they replace, they tend to capture the pilot's attention and hold it for long periods of time. To avoid this phenomenon, the pilot should plan in advance when and where programming for approaches, route changes, and airport information gathering should be accomplished, as well as times it should not. Pilot familiarity with the equipment, the route, and the local air traffic control environment, and personal capabilities vis-a-vis the automation should drive when, where, and how the automation is programmed and used. The pilot should also consider what his or her capabilities are in response to last-minute changes of the approach and the reprogramming required, and ability to make large-scale changes, a reroute for instance, while hand-flying the aircraft. Since formats are not standardized, simply moving from one manufacturer's equipment to another should give the pilot pause and require more conservative planning and decisions. The SRM process is simple. At least 5 times before and during the flight, the pilot should review and consider plan, the plane, the pilot, the passengers, and the programming, and make the appropriate decision required by the current situation. It is often said that failure to make a decision is a decision. Under SRM and the 5 Ps, even the decision to make no changes to the current plan is made through careful consideration of all the risk factors present. Information management. The volume of information presented in aviation training is enormous, but part of the process of good SRM is a continuous flow of information in and actions out. How a student manages the flow of information definitely has an effect on the relative success or failure of each and every flight, because proper information contributes to valid decisions. SBT plays an important part in teaching the student how to gather pertinent information from all available sources, make appropriate decisions, and assess the actions taken. For a transitioning pilot, the primary flight display, PFD, multifunction display, MFD, and GPS/very high frequency, VHF navigator screens seem to offer too much information presented in colorful menus and submenus. In fact, the student may be overwhelmed and unable to find a specific piece of information. The first critical information management skill for flying with advanced avionics is to understand the system at a conceptual level. Remembering how the system is organized helps the pilot manage the available information. Simulation software and books on the specific system used are of great value in further understanding for both the CFI and the student. Another information management skill is reading. The best strategy for assessing and managing the available information from PFD to navigational charts is to stop, look, and read. The goal is for the student to learn how to monitor, manage, and prioritize the information flow to accomplish specific tasks. Task management, TM. Task management, TM, a significant factor in flight safety, is the process by which pilots manage the many concurrent tasks that must be performed to safely and efficiently fly a modern aircraft. A task is a function performed by a human as opposed to one performed by a machine, e.g., setting the target heading in the autopilot. The flight deck is an environment in which potentially many important tasks compete for pilot attention at a given time. TM determines which of perhaps many concurrent tasks the pilots attend to at any particular point in time. More specifically, TM entails initiation of new tasks, monitoring of ongoing tasks to determine their status, prioritization of tasks based on their importance, status, urgency, and other factors, allocation of human and machine resources to high-priority tasks, interruption and subsequent resumption of lower priority tasks, and termination of tasks that are completed or no longer relevant. Humans have a limited capacity for information. Once information flow exceeds a person's ability to mentally process the information, any additional information becomes unattended or displaces other tasks and information already being processed. Once the information flow reaches its limit, two alternatives exist: shed the unimportant tasks or perform all tasks at less than optimal level. Like an electrical circuit being overloaded, either the consumption must be reduced or a circuit failure is experienced. Once again, SBT helps the student learn how to effectively manage tasks and properly prioritize them. Automation management. Automation management is the demonstrated ability to control and navigate an aircraft by means of the automated systems installed in the aircraft. One of the most important concepts of automation management is knowing when to use it and when not to use it. Ideally, the goal of the flight instructor is to train the student until he or she has learned how to perform PTS maneuvers and procedures in the aircraft using all the available automation and/or the autopilot. However, the flight instructor must ensure the student also knows how to turn everything off and hand fly the maneuver when the safety of the flight is threatened. Advanced avionics offer multiple levels of automation, from strictly manual flight to highly automated flight. No one level of automation is appropriate for all flight situations. But in order to avoid potentially dangerous distractions when flying with advanced avionics, the student must know how to manage the course indicator, the navigation source, and the autopilot. It is important for a student to know the peculiarities of the particular automated system being used. This ensures the student knows what to expect, how to monitor for proper operation, and promptly take appropriate action if the system does not perform as expected. At the most basic level, managing the autopilot means knowing at all times which modes are engaged and which modes are armed to engage. The student needs to verify that armed functions, e.g., navigation tracking or altitude capture, engage at the appropriate time. Automation management is a good place to practice the call-out technique, especially after arming the system to make a change in course or altitude. Teaching decision-making skills. When instructor pilots discuss system safety, they generally worry about the loss of traditional stick and rudder skills. The fear is that emphasis on items such as risk management, ADM, SRM, and situational awareness detracts from the training necessary in developing safe pilots. It is important to understand that system safety flight training occurs in 3 phases. First, there are the traditional stick and rudder maneuvers. In order to apply the critical thinking skills that are to follow, pilots must first have a high degree of confidence in their ability to fly the aircraft. Next, the tenets of system safety are introduced into the training environment as students begin to learn how to best identify hazards, manage risk, and use all available resources to make each flight as safe as possible. This can be accomplished through scenarios that emphasize the skill sets being taught. Finally, the student is introduced to more complex scenarios, demanding focus on several safety of flight issues. Thus, scenarios should start out rather simply, then progress in complexity and intensity as the student can handle the learning load. A traditional stick and rudder maneuver, such as short field landings, can be used to illustrate how ADM and risk management can be incorporated into instruction. In Phase 1, the initial focus is on developing the stick and rudder skills required to execute this operation safely. These include power and airspeed management, aircraft configuration, placement in the pattern, wind correction, determining the proper aim point and sight picture, etc. By emphasizing these points through repetition and practice, a student eventually acquires the skills needed to execute a short field landing. Phase 2 introduces the many factors that come into play when performing a short field landing, which include runway conditions, no-flap landings, airport obstructions, and rejected landings. The introduction of such items need not increase training times. In fact, all of the hazards or considerations referenced in the short field landing lesson plan may be discussed in detail during the ground portion of the instructional program. For example, if training has been conducted at an airport that enjoys an obstruction-free 6,000-foot runway, consider the implications of operating the same aircraft out of an 1,800-foot strip with an obstruction off the departure end. Add to that additional considerations, such as operating the aircraft at close to its maximum gross weight under conditions of high-density altitude, and now a single training scenario has several layers of complexity. The ensuing discussion provides a valuable training exercise, and it comes with little additional ground and no added flight training. Finally, Phase 3 takes the previously discussed hazards, risks, and considerations and incorporates them into a complex scenario. This forces a student to consider not only a specific lesson item, in this case short field landings, but also requires that it be viewed in the greater context of the overall flight. For example, on a cross-country flight, the student is presented with a realistic distraction, perhaps the illness of a passenger. This forces a diversion to an alternate for which the student has not planned. The new destination airport has 2 runways, the longest of which is closed due to construction. The remaining runway is short, but while less than ideal, should prove suitable for landing. However, upon entering the pattern, the student finds the electrically driven flaps do not extend. The student must consider whether to press on and attempt the landing or proceed to a secondary alternate. If he or she decides to go forward and attempt the landing, this proves an excellent time to test the requisite stick and rudder skills. If the student decides to proceed to a second alternate, this opens new training opportunities. Proceeding further tests cross-country skills, such as navigation, communication, management of a passenger in distress, as well as the other tasks associated with simply flying the aircraft. The outlined methodology simply takes a series of seemingly unrelated tasks and scripts them into a training exercise requiring both mechanical and cognitive skills to complete it successfully. SBT helps the flight instructor effectively teach ADM and risk management. The what, why, and how of SBT has been discussed extensively throughout this handbook. In teaching ADM, it is important to remember the learning objective is for the student to exercise sound judgment and make good decisions. Thus, the flight instructor must be ready to turn the responsibility for planning and execution of the flight over to the student as soon as possible. Although the flight instructor continues to demonstrate and instruct skill maneuvers, when the student begins to make decisions, the flight instructor should revert to the role of mentor and/or learning facilitator. The flight instructor is an integral part of the system's approach to training and is crucial to the implementation of an SBT program, which underlies the teaching of ADM. Remember, for SBT instruction to be effective, it is vital the flight instructor and the student establish the following information: scenario destinations, desired student learning outcomes, desired level of student performance, possible in-flight scenario changes. It is also important for the flight instructor to remember that a good scenario is not a test, will not have a single correct answer, does not offer an obvious answer, engages all three learning domains, is interactive, should not promote errors, should promote situational awareness and opportunities for decision-making, requires time-pressured decisions. The flight instructor should make the situation as realistic as possible. This means the student knows where he or she is going and what transpires on the flight. While the actual flight may deviate from the original plan, it allows the student to be placed in a realistic scenario. The student will plan the flight to include route, destinations, weather, NOTAMs, possible emergency procedures. Since the scenarios may have several good outcomes and a few poor ones, the flight instructor should understand in advance which outcomes are positive and or negative and give the student the freedom to make both good and poor decisions. This does not mean that the student should be allowed to make an unsafe decision or commit an unsafe act. However, it does allow the students to make decisions that fit their experience level and result in positive outcomes. Teaching decision-making skills has become an integral part of flight training. The word decision is used several times in each PTS, and applicants are judged on their ability to make a decision as well as their ability to perform a task. Thus, it is important for CFIs to remember that decision-making is a component of the PTS. Assessing SRM skills. The student's performance is often assessed only on a technical level. The instructor determines whether maneuvers are technically accurate and that procedures are performed in the right order. In SRM assessment, instructors must learn to assess students on a different level. How did the student arrive at a particular decision? What resources were used? Was risk assessed accurately when a go, no-go decision was made? Did the student maintain situational awareness in the traffic pattern? Was workload managed effectively during a cross-country flight? How does the student handle stress and fatigue? Instructors should continually evaluate student decision-making ability and offer suggestions for improvement. It is not always necessary to present complex situations which require detailed analysis. By allowing students to make decisions about typical issues as they arise throughout the course of training, such as their fitness to fly, weather conditions, and equipment problems, instructors can address effective decision-making and allow students to develop judgment skills. For example, when a discrepancy is found during pre-flight inspection, the student should be allowed to initially determine the action to be taken. Then, the effectiveness of the student's choice and other options that may be available can be discussed. Opportunities for improving decision-making abilities occur often during training. If the tower offers the student a runway that requires landing with a tailwind in order to expedite traffic, the student can be directed to assess the risks involved and asked to present alternative actions to be taken. Perhaps the most frequent choice that has to be made during flight training is the go, no-go decision based on weather. While the final choice to fly lies with the instructor, students can be required to assess the weather prior to each flight and make a go, no-go determination. In addition, instructors should utilize SBT to create lessons that are specifically designed to test whether students are applying SRM skills. Planning a flight lesson in which the student is presented with simulated emergencies, a heavy workload, or other operational problems can be valuable in assessing the student's judgment and decision-making skills. During the flight, student performance can be evaluated for workload and/or stress management. As discussed in Chapter 5, SRM grades are based on these four components. Explain. The student can verbally identify, describe, and understand the risks inherent in the flight scenario. The student needs to be prompted to identify risks and make decisions. Practice. The student is able to identify understand, and apply SRM principles to the actual flight situation. Coaching, instruction, and/or assistance from the CFI quickly corrects minor deviations and errors identified by the CFI. The student is an active decision maker. Manage, decide. The student can correctly gather the most important data available both within and outside the flight deck, identify possible courses of action, evaluate the risk inherent in each course of action, and make the appropriate decision. Instructor intervention is not required for the safe completion of the flight. Not observed. Any event not accomplished or required. Post-flight, collaborative assessment or learner-centered grading, LCG, also discussed in Chapter 5, is a vital component of assessing a student's SRM skills. As a reminder, collaborative assessment includes two parts: learner self-assessment and a detailed assessment by the flight instructor. The purpose of the self-assessment is to stimulate growth in the student's thought processes and, in turn, behaviors. The self-assessment is followed by an in-depth discussion between the flight instructor and the student, which compares the CFI's assessment to the student's self-assessment. An important element of SRM skill assessment is that the CFI provides a clear picture of the progress the student is making during the training. Grading should also be progressive. During each flight, the student should achieve a new level of learning. For Flight 1, the automation management area might be a describe item. By Flight 3, it would be a practice item, and by Flight 5, manage decide item. Chapter Summary. This chapter introduced aviation instructors to the underlying concepts of safety risk management, which the FAA is integrating into all levels of the aviation community. End of Chapter 9. Appendix B of Aviation Instructor's Handbook by the FAA. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Appendix B, Developing a Test Item Bank. Developing a test item bank is one of the instructor's most difficult tasks. Besides requiring considerable time and effort, this task demands mastery of the subject, an ability to write clearly, and an ability to visualize realistic situations for use in developing problems. Because it is so difficult to develop good test items, a semi-permanent record of items that have been developed is desirable. One way of preserving test items is to record the test item along with the analysis of each question on a set of cards. If questions are maintained on a computer, provisions should be made to include appropriate analysis gathered, thus creating a useful database. In either case, the result is a pool of test questions. As long as precautions are taken to safeguard the security of test bank items, this collection lightens the instructor's burden of continuously preparing new items. Figure B-1. Written test items. Supply type. Supply type test items require the learner to furnish a response in the form of a word, sentence, or paragraph. The supply type item requires the learner to organize knowledge. It demands an ability to express ideas and is thus valuable in measuring the learner's generalized understanding of a subject. For example, the supply type item on a pre-solo knowledge test can be very helpful in determining whether the pilot in training has adequate knowledge of procedures. There are several disadvantages to supply type items. First, they cannot be graded with reliability. The same test graded by different instructors could be assigned different scores. Even the same test graded by the same instructor on consecutive days might be assigned altogether different scores. Second, supply type items require more time for the learner to complete and more time for the instructor to grade. Selection type. Selection type test items require the learner to select from two or more alternatives. There is a single correct response for each item. It assumes all learners should learn the same thing and relies on rote memorization of facts. Written tests made up of selection type items are highly reliable, meaning that the results would be graded the same regardless of the learner taking the test or the person grading it. In fact, this type of test item lends itself very well to machine scoring. Also, selection type items make it possible to directly compare learner accomplishment. For example, it is possible to compare the performance of learners within one class to learners in a different class, or learners under one instructor with those under another instructor. By using selection type items, the instructor can test on many more areas of knowledge in a given time than could be done by requiring the learner to supply written responses. This increase in comprehensiveness can be expected to increase validity and discrimination. Another advantage is that selection type tests are well adapted to statistical item analysis. True-false. The true-false test consists of a statement followed by the opportunity for the learner to choose whether the statement is true or false. This item type has a wide range of usage. It is well adapted to testing knowledge of facts and details, especially when there are only two possible answers. The chief disadvantage is that true-false questions create the greatest probability of guessing. Also, true-false questions are more likely to utilize rote memory than knowledge of the subject. In general, therefore, true-false questions are not considered valid, i.e., they do not measure what they are intended to measure. To use true-false questions, consider the following guidelines for effective test items. Include only one idea in each statement. Use original statements rather than verbatim text. Make the statement entirely true or entirely false. Avoid the unnecessary use of negatives, which tend to confuse the reader. Underline or otherwise emphasize the negative words if they must be used. Avoid involved statements. Keep wording and sentence structure as simple as possible. Make statements both definite and clear. Avoid the use of ambiguous words and terms, some, any, generally, most times, etc. Use terms which mean the same thing to all learners whenever possible. Avoid absolutes, all, every, only, no, never, etc. These words are known as determiners because they provide clues to the correct answer. Avoid patterns in the sequence of correct responses because learners can often identify the patterns. Make statements brief and approximately same length. State the source of a statement if it is controversial. Sources have differing information. Multiple choice. A multiple choice test item consists of two parts: the stem, which includes the question, statement, or problem, and a list of possible responses. Incorrect answers are called distractors. When properly devised and constructed, multiple choice items offer several advantages that make this type more widely used and versatile than either the matching or the true-false items. Figure B-2. Multiple choice test questions can help determine learner achievement, ranging from acquisition of facts to understanding, reasoning, and ability to apply what has been learned. It is appropriate to use multiple choice when the question, statement, or problem has the following characteristics: built-in and unique solution, such as a specific application of laws or principles. Wording of the item is clearly limiting, so that the learner must choose the best of several offered solutions rather than a universal solution. Several options that are plausible or even scientifically accurate. Several pertinent solutions, with the learner asked to identify the most appropriate solution. Three major challenges are common in the construction of multiple choice test items. One is the development of a question or an item stem that must be expressed clearly and without ambiguity. A second is that the statement of an answer or correct response cannot be refuted. Finally, the distractors must be written in such a way that they are attractive to those learners who do not possess the knowledge or understanding necessary to recognize the keyed response. A multiple choice item stem may take one of several basic forms: a direct question followed by several possible answers, an incomplete sentence followed by several possible phrases that complete the sentence, a stated problem based on an accompanying graph, diagram, or other artwork, followed by the correct response and the distractors. The learner may be asked to select the one correct choice or completion, the choice that is an incorrect answer or completion, or the one choice that is the best answer option presented in the test item. Beginning test writers find it easier to write items in the question form. In general, the form with the options as answers to a question is preferable to the form that uses an incomplete statement as the stem. It is more easily phrased, and it is more natural for the learner to read. Less likely to contain ambiguities, it usually results in more similarity between the options and gives fewer clues to the correct response. When multiple choice questions are used, 3 or 4 alternatives are generally provided. It is usually difficult to construct more than 4 convincing responses. That is, responses which appear to be correct to a person who has not mastered the subject matter. Learners are not supposed to guess the correct option. They should select an alternative only if they know it is correct. An effective means of diverting the learner from the correct response is to use common learner errors as distractors. For example, if writing a question on the conversion of degrees Celsius to degrees Fahrenheit, providing alternatives derived by using incorrect formulas would be logical, since using the wrong formula is a common learner error. Items intended to measure the rote level of learning should have only one correct alternative. All other alternatives should be clearly incorrect. When items are to measure achievement at a higher level of learning, some or all of the alternatives should be acceptable responses, but one should be clearly better than the others. In either case, the instructions given should direct the learner to select the best alternative. To use multiple choice questions, consider the following guidelines for construction of effective test items. Make each item independent of every other item in the test. Do not permit one question to reveal or depend on the correct answer to another question. Design questions that call for essential knowledge rather than for abstract background knowledge or unimportant facts. State each question in language appropriate to the learners. Include sketches, diagrams, or pictures when they can present a situation more vividly than words. They generally speed the learning process, add interest, and help to avoid reading difficulties and technical language. When a negative is used, emphasize the negative word or phrase by underlining, boldfacing, italicizing, or printing in a different color. Avoid questions containing double negatives, which invariably cause confusion. Avoid trick questions, unimportant details, ambiguities, and leading questions that confuse and antagonize the learner. If attention to detail is an objective, detailed construction of alternatives is preferred to trick questions. Stems. In developing the stem of a multiple choice question, the following principles should be utilized. Figure B-3. The stem should clearly present the central problem or idea. The function of the stem is to set the stage for the alternatives that follow. The stem should contain only material relevant to its solution, unless the selection of what is relevant is part of the problem. The stem should be worded in such a way that it does not give away the correct response. Avoid the use of determiners such as clue words or phrases. Put everything that pertains to all alternatives in the stem of the item. This helps to avoid repetitious alternatives and saves time. Generally avoid using a or an at the end of a stem. This may give away the correct choice. Every alternative should grammatically fit with the stem of the item. Alternatives. The alternatives to a multiple choice test are as important as the stem. They should be formulated with care. Simply being incorrect should not be the only criterion for the distracting alternatives. Popular distractors are an incorrect response related to the situation which sounds convincing, a common misconception, a statement which is true but which does not satisfy the requirements of the problem, a statement that is either too broad or too narrow for the requirements of the problem. Research of instructor-made tests reveals that, in general, correct alternatives are longer than incorrect ones. When alternatives are numbers, they should generally be listed in ascending or descending orders of magnitude or length. Matching. A matching test item consists of 2 lists, which may include a combination of words, terms, illustrations, phrases, or sentences. The learner must match alternatives in one list with related alternatives in a second list. In reality, a matching exercise is a collection of related multiple-choice items. In a given period of time, more samples of learners' knowledge usually can be measured with matching rather than with multiple-choice items. The matching item is particularly good for measuring a learner's ability to recognize relationships and to make associations between terms, parts, words, phrases, clauses, or symbols listed in one column with related items in another column. Matching reduces the probability of guessing correct responses, especially if alternatives may be used more than once. The testing time can also be used more efficiently. The following guidelines help the construction of effective matching test items. Give specific and complete instructions. Do not make the learner guess what is required. Test only essential information. Never test unimportant details. Use closely related materials throughout an item. If learners can divide the alternatives into distinct groups, the item is reduced to several multiple-choice items with few alternatives, and the possibility of guessing is distinctly increased. Make all alternatives credible responses to each element in the first column, whenever possible, to minimize guessing by elimination. Use language the learner can understand. By reducing language barriers, both the validity and reliability of the test is improved. Arrange the alternatives in some sensible order. An alphabetical arrangement is common. Matching type test items are either equal column or unequal column. An equal column test item has the same number of alternatives in each column. When using this form, always provide some letters in the response column to be used more than once, or not at all, to preclude guessing by elimination. Unequal column type tests have more alternatives in the second column than in the first, and are generally preferable to equal columns. End of Appendix B. Appendix C of Aviation Instructor's Handbook by the FAA. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Appendix C, Certificates, Ratings, and Endorsements. Flight Instructor Endorsements. The authority and responsibility for flight instructors to endorse initial student certificates, logbooks for solo and solo cross-country, additional aircraft ratings, and flight privileges are outlined in Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations, 14 CFR, Part 61. In addition, Advisory Circular AC 61-65, Certification, Pilots and Flight Instructors, and Ground Instructors, provides guidance for pilots, flight instructors, ground instructors, and examiners on the certification standards, knowledge test procedures, and other requirements of 14 CFR Part 61. By utilizing AC 61-65, the flight instructor does not omit any required endorsement for the rating sought, which ensures standardization. It is important for the flight instructor to understand and use AC 61-65 in the certification process. Additionally, flight instructors are required to make an endorsement in the student or applicant's logbook or training record whenever the flight instructor provides flight or ground training. At a minimum, this endorsement should include what actions or instructions were completed and, if any, regulatory requirements were met. Citing the appropriate portion of 14 CFR Part 61 is also recommended. Flight instructors also have the responsibility to make logbook endorsements for pilots who are already certificated, such as sport, recreational, private, commercial, and instrument-rated pilots, as well as flight instructors. Typical endorsements include, but are not limited to, flight reviews, instrument proficiency checks, the additional training required for high-performance, high-altitude, and tailwheel aircraft, and types of glider launches. Additional rating applicants, e.g., multi-engine add-on, seaplane add-on, glider add-on, helicopter add-on, are rated pilots and not considered student pilots in accordance with IAW 14 CFR Part 61. Flight instructors must endorse the applicant's logbook prior to solo flight and prior to being evaluated for that rating with an endorsement from AC 61-65, stating that the applicant is competent to act as the pilot in command, PIC, of an aircraft in which he or she does not hold a category or class rating. The flight instructor may add additional requirements or restrictions to the endorsement, such as an expiration date. Practical test endorsements are addressed in AC 61-65. These endorsements are regulatory and the pilot applicant must comply with them. Flight instructors are responsible for properly documenting a student or applicant's completion of prerequisites for a practical test. Examples of all common endorsements can be found in AC 61-65, Appendix C. Further details about the requirements for each respective endorsement can be found in 14 CFR Part 61. These examples contain the essential elements of each endorsement with the goal of providing guidance and encouraging standardization among instructors. The flight instructor may need to customize the endorsement due to an applicant's special circumstances or changes in regulatory requirements, but it is recommended all endorsements be worded as closely as possible to those in AC 61-65. At a minimum, the flight instructor needs to cite the appropriate 14 CFR Part 61 section that has been completed. Figure C-1. Federal Aviation Administration, FAA inspectors and designated pilot examiners, DPEs, rely on flight instructor recommendations for student or pilot applicant testing. These recommendations are accepted as evidence of qualification for certification and proof that a review of the subject areas found to be deficient on the appropriate knowledge test has been given by the flight instructor. Recommendations also provide assurance the applicant has had a thorough briefing on the practical test standards, PTS, and the associated knowledge areas, maneuvers, and procedures. If the flight instructor has trained and prepared the applicant competently, the applicant should have no difficulty in passing the written and practical tests. Sport pilot. Many consider the advent of the sport pilot certification to be one of the most significant changes to the airman certification structure to have occurred in over 50 years. Because of the growing cost to acquire the private pilot certification, more and more aviation enthusiasts were considering the sport pilot as an alternative. Many aircraft already meet the light sport aircraft criteria, and many manufacturers are now producing modern light sport aircraft. It is likely that flight instructors will be asked to provide information and possibly training for this new certificate. Flight instructors should review 14 CFR Part 61, Subparts J and K, for the requirements and privileges and limitations of the sport pilot certifications, as well as the new endorsement requirements. Of particular interest has been the medical requirement. Subparts J and K also describe the process for sport pilots and flight instructors with a sport pilot rating to add additional category/class privileges. Since light sport aircraft must meet certain criteria, a well-informed flight instructor would be expected to be acquainted with the basic requirements. FAA Forms 8710-1, 8610-1, and 8710-11. Forms 8710-1, 8610-2, and 8710-11 are the print versions of the Airman Certificate and/or rating application. Again, the instructor ensures the applicant is prepared for the test and has met all regulatory requirements, including knowledge, proficiency, required endorsements, and experience requirements before the application process. The applicant then either completes the 8710 or 8610 paper form by hand or completes a digital computer-based form found on the FAA website. This form is in PDF. Remind the student that while the form can be completed online, the data cannot be saved and the applicant must print a copy before closing the window or the data will be lost. Instructions for completing the form are available on the website. After printing the requisite form, the applicant physically signs it, and then the instructor verifies the information and signs the form, which the DPE mails to the nearest FSDO. Downloadable versions of the FAA Form 8710-1 and 8610-2 are available at www.faa.gov/library/forms/. Figures C2 and C3 are examples of a private pilot applicant who received training under 14 CFR Part 61. This is only an example, since the form is periodically revised to reflect changes in the applicable rules and regulations. If the current form is a later edition than the one shown here, the instructions must be read very carefully to ensure all areas of the form are filled out correctly. The example shown is annotated with additional guidance to clarify or reinforce certain areas that are frequently found incomplete by the FAA during the certification process. Instructor records. 14 CFR Part 61 requires the flight instructor to maintain a record that includes information of the type of endorsement, the name of the person receiving the endorsement, and the date of the endorsement. This information must be kept in a logbook or a separate document. For a knowledge or practical test endorsement, the record must include the kind of test, the date, and the results. Records of endorsements must be maintained for at least 3 years. Knowledge tests. When preparing an applicant for the private certification or higher grade rating, e.g. commercial or instrument, a test is required to ensure that the student has adequate aeronautical knowledge in those subject areas listed in 14 CFR Part 61. The flight instructor may provide the student with an endorsement to certify he or she has the required knowledge to pass the knowledge test. Some additional ratings do not require a knowledge test. For information concerning additional aircraft certifications that do not require knowledge tests, refer to AC 61-65. Flight instructors must take a short question test for additional category. As a general rule, the following may be determined if a knowledge test for private, commercial, or instrument rating is required, but the flight instructor should review 14 CFR Part 61. If the applicant fails a knowledge test, the flight or ground instructor must sign the written test after he or she has given additional training for a retake of the test. Additional training and endorsements. Flight instructors often provide required training and endorsements for certificated pilots. AC 61-98, currency and additional qualification requirements for certificated pilots, contains information to assist the instructor in providing training/endorsements for flight reviews, instrument proficiency checks, and transitions to other makes and models of aircraft. Included in the AC are general guidance to each of these areas, references to other related documents, and sample training plans that are pertinent to this type of training. Flight reviews. The purpose of the flight review, required by 14 CFR Section 61.56, is to provide for regular evaluation of pilot skills and aeronautical knowledge. According to the regulation, it is also intended to offer pilots the opportunity to design a personal currency and proficiency program in consultation with the CFI. In effect, the flight review is the aeronautical equivalent of a regular medical checkup and ongoing health improvement program. The conduct of flight reviews for certificated pilots is a responsibility of the flight instructor and is also an excellent opportunity for the instructor to expand his or her professional services. The flight review is intended to be an industry-managed, FAA-monitored currency program. The flight review is not a test or a check ride, but an instructional service designed to assess a pilot's knowledge and skills. As stated in 14 CFR Part 61, no person may act as PIC of an aircraft unless a flight review has been accomplished within the preceding 24 calendar months. Effective pilot refresher training must be based on specific objectives and standards. The objectives should include a thorough checkout appropriate to the pilot certificate and aircraft rating held, and the standards should be at least those required for the issuance of a pilot certificate. Before beginning any training, the pilot and the instructor should agree fully on those objectives and standards, and as training progresses, The pilot should be kept appraised of progress toward achieving those goals. A flight review is an excellent opportunity for a certificated flight instructor, CFI, to review pilot decision-making skills. To get the information needed to evaluate ADM skills, including risk management, give the pilot multiple opportunities to make decisions and ask questions about those decisions. For example, ask the pilot to explain why the alternate airport selected for the diversion exercise is a safe and appropriate choice. What are the possible hazards, and what can the pilot do to mitigate them? Be alert to the pilot's information and automation management skills as well. For example, does the pilot perform regular common-sense cross-checks? For more ideas on generating scenarios that teach risk management, visit www.faa.gov/library/manuals/pilot_risk/. AC-61-98, Currency and Additional Qualification Requirements for Certificated Pilots, Chapter 1, provides guidance for conducting the flight review. Appendix B is a sample flight review plan and checklist. Appendix C is a sample of flight review knowledge, maneuvers, and procedures, and it contains recommended procedures and standards for general pilot refresher courses. At the conclusion of a successful flight review, the logbook of the pilot should be endorsed as recommended by AC 61-65, Figure 4-C. In addition to the required maneuvers conducted during the flight review, flight instructors should also review and discuss those special emphasis items listed in the Flight Instructor PTS. Instrument Proficiency Checks. Instrument-rated pilots who have not met instrument currency requirements in the preceding 6 months or for 6 months thereafter are required by 14 CFR Part 61 to pass an instrument proficiency check ride in order to regain their instrument flying privileges. AC 61-98 contains guidance for the conduct of an instrument proficiency check, including a sample plan of action and checklist. The primary reference for specific maneuvers and any associated tolerances for an instrument proficiency check ride is the Instrument Rating PTS, which includes a matrix table of required operations and tasks. A pilot taking an instrument proficiency check is expected to meet the criteria of the specific tasks selected in the Instrument Rating PTS. Aircraft and instrument ratings appropriate to the aircraft being flown must be listed on the flight instructor's instructor certificate. Part or all of the check may be conducted in a flight training device or flight simulator that meets 14 CFR Part 141.41 requirements. The FAA FSDO, having jurisdiction over the area where the device is used, must specifically approve each flight training device or flight simulator. If planning to use a flight training device or flight simulator to conduct all or part of an instrument proficiency check, instructors should contact the local FSDO to verify the approval status of the device. Aircraft checkouts/transitions. Certificated pilots depend on flight instructors for aircraft checkouts and transition training, including high-performance airplanes, tailwheel airplanes, motor gliders, and aircraft capable of flight at high altitudes. The flight instructor who checks out and certifies the competency of a pilot in an aircraft for which type rating is not required by regulations is accepting a major responsibility for the safety of future passengers. Many newer light airplanes are comparable in performance and complexity to transport airplanes. For these, the flight instructor's checkout should be at least as thorough as an official type rating practical test. Other considerations include AC 61-98 provides a list of requirements for transitioning to other makes and models of aircraft, along with a sample training plan. AC 61-98 also lists other publications that can be useful in conducting checkouts. All checkouts should be conducted to the performance standards required by the appropriate PTS for the pilot certificate. For motor glider transition training, refer to AC 61-94, Pilot Transition Course for Self-Launching or Powered Sailplanes, Motor Gliders. Flight instructors should ensure they meet the recommendation experience cited in the AC 61-94 to conduct this special qualification. For the conduct of an aircraft checkout, it is essential the flight instructor is fully qualified in the aircraft used and thoroughly familiar with its operating procedures, AFM, and operating limitations. An instructor who does not meet the recent flight experience prescribed by regulations for the aircraft concerned should not attempt to check out another pilot. The flight instructor should utilize a plan of action and a written training syllabus based on the appropriate PTS and record in the pilot's logbook the exact extent of any checkout conducted. This record serves a twofold purpose. It benefits the pilot concerned, and it protects the flight instructor if questions arise later. In the event the instructor finds a pilot's performance to be insufficient to allow sign-off, the pilot should be thoroughly debriefed on all problem areas and further instruction scheduled. In some cases, a referral to another instructor may be appropriate. Pilot proficiency. Professional flight instructors maintain knowledge and skill as instructors and as pilots. The flight instructor is at the leading edge of the aviation industry's efforts to improve aviation safety through additional training. The FAA encourages instructor-pilot proficiency in two ways: by requiring a flight instructor to renew his or her certificate every 24 months, via the Pilot Proficiency Award Program, described in AC 61-91. Endorsements. Application for airman certification and/or rating. In order to improve the application process, the FAA is moving from a paper-based method of application to an internet method. Although the application form for pilots and mechanics are available for download at www.faa.gov/library/forms/, the FAA encourages aviation instructors to become familiar with the internet method described below. Integrated Airman Certification and/or Rating Application, IACRA. In the fall of 2003, the FAA released the Integrated Airman Certification and/or Rating Application, an internet-based database program providing a fully electronic method of applying for an airman certification or rating, located at http://acra.faa.gov/IACRA/. It electronically captures and validates airman information required to complete the airman application. IACRA can be accessed from any location with internet connectivity. Figure C-5. IACRA interfaces with multiple FAA national databases to validate data and verify specific fields. IACRA automatically ensures applicants meet regulatory and policy requirements through business rules and data validation. It implements the use of digital signatures throughout the certification process. IACRA automatically forwards the 8710 application and test results to the Airman Registry. IACRA replaces the Airman Certification and/or Rating Application, CD, ACRA, a standalone computer-based PC program that was the FAA's first effort to automate the application process. With new paths of application added weekly, the IACRA program team continues to develop IACRA's capability. Currently, the program can process virtually all pilot applications from Sport Pilot through Airline Transport Pilot, ATP, type ratings, certificated flight instructors, mechanics, and most repairmen. If the applicant chooses to complete the Airman Certificate and/or Rating Application using IACRA, the instructor should ensure the applicant is prepared for the test and has met all the regulatory requirements, including knowledge, proficiency, required endorsements, and experience requirements. Suggest the applicant visit the IACRA site, review the frequently asked questions, and read the document Getting Started Desktop Instructions before completing an application. Stress the importance of the applicant having all pertinent information readily available before logging on. If the applicant has all necessary information available, the process should not take over 10 minutes. Remind the applicant The instructor can supervise the application process, or the instructor can log on to IACRA anytime after the applicant has completed the initial process and call up the application based on the FAA tracking number, FTN, assigned to the applicant. When using IACRA, the applicant must complete the applicant's section and the instructor certifies the applicant's information. An online public accessible training center for IACRA hosted by the FAA Safety Team, FAA-STEAM, FAST Team, at http://faasafety.gov is under development. When operational, there will be a link on the IACRA website to the training center. A number of different training aids to include the fully interactive Practice IACRA program will be available. This program will enable the instructor to fill out practice applications, review them, and sign them off, giving the instructor a better feel for the entire process. Student Pilot Endorsements. Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations, 14 CFR, Section 61.189, requires instructors to sign the logbook of each person they have given ground or flight training. Advisory Circular AC 61-65 contains suggested endorsements, and this appendix reprints several of the more commonly used endorsements. See pages C-8 and C-9. All of these examples contain the essential elements, but it is not necessary for endorsements to be worded exactly as those in the AC. For example, changes to regulatory requirements may affect the wording, or the instructor may customize the endorsements for any special circumstances of the student. Certificates, ratings, and endorsements. Certificates. The basic airman qualifications document that the FAA issues is called a certificate. The pilot certificate level depends upon the extent of training and testing required. The FAA separately issues instructor certificates. A pilot certificate, commercial or ATP, is required to exercise the privileges of some, but not all, instructor certificates. See figure, page C-10. Ratings. Except for student and sport pilot certificates, all pilot and instructor certificates have associated ratings. A rating specifies what and or how the pilot is qualified to fly. There are several kinds of ratings. See figure, page C-10. There are many possible combinations of certificates and ratings for aircraft category and class. For example, you might have a commercial pilot certificate with an airplane single-engine land rating. If you train and test in a multi-engine airplane to the private pilot certificate level rather than the commercial level, you will still have a commercial pilot certificate with an airplane single-engine land rating, but it will note that you have a multi-engine land rating with private pilot privileges. Endorsements. An endorsement attests to the completion of ground and or flight training required for specific operating privileges or for airman certification testing. Except for certain endorsements made in pen and ink on a student pilot certificate, the endorsements required by 14 CFR Part 61 fall into several broad categories. Student pilots. Because a student pilot certificate has no aircraft category and class rating, operating privileges and limitations for solo flight are conveyed exclusively through instructor endorsements. Endorsements in this category are usually limited not just to aircraft category and class, but also to a specific make and model. Student pilot endorsements can also specify weather limitations. Sport pilots. Like a student pilot certificate, a sport pilot certificate is issued without aircraft category and class ratings. Logbook endorsements specify the category, class, make, and model of aircraft that the sport pilot is authorized to fly as pilot in command. Testing for a certificate or rating. To take a knowledge test or practical test for most pilot certificates and ratings, the applicant must have endorsements attesting to aeronautical knowledge and flight proficiency, including aeronautical experience and practical test preparations required in 14 CFR 61.31 A6. The flight instructor applicant endorsements for completing the fundamentals of instruction and spin training fall into this category as well. Recurrent training. To maintain the operating privileges conferred by a pilot certificate or instrument rating, the pilot must have an endorsement for satisfactory completion of required recurrent training, e.g., flight review or instrument proficiency check. Aircraft characteristics. The requirement for a type rating is limited to large, greater than 12,500 pounds, MGTOW, maximum gross takeoff weight, and turbojet power aircraft. However, certain small and piston-powered aircraft have characteristics that require additional training for safe operation. For example, 14 CFR 61.69 specifies training and experience required for towing a glider. Specific additional aircraft training requirements are outlined in 14 CFR 61.31, and instructor endorsements that attest to the satisfactory completion of this training or a mechanism used to confer the necessary operating privilege. Endorsements related to aircraft characteristics include those for complex, high-performance, high-altitude, tailwheel, and glider ground operations. In addition, 14 CFR 61.31H provides for additional aircraft type specific training in cases where the FAA has determined that such training is required. End of Appendix C. Appendix D of Aviation Instructor's Handbook by the FAA. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Appendix D, Personal Minimums Checklist. Your Personal Minimums Checklist is an easy-to-use personal tool tailored to your level of skill, knowledge, and ability. It helps you control and manage risk by identifying even subtle risk factors. Allows you to fly with less stress and less risk. Practice conservatism without guilt. Each item provides you with either a space to complete a personal minimum or a checklist item to think about. Spend some quiet time completing each blank and consider other items that apply to your personal minimums. Give yourself permission to choose higher minimums than those specified in the regulations, aircraft flight manuals, or other rules. How to use your checklist. Use this checklist just as you would use one for your aircraft. Carry the checklist in your flight kit. Use it at home as you start planning a flight, and again, just before you make your final decision to fly. Be wary if you have an item that's marginal in any single risk category. But if you have items in more than one category, you may be headed for trouble. If you have marginal items in two or more risk factor/categories, do not go. Periodically review and revise your checklist as your personal circumstances change, such as your proficiency, recency, or training. You should never make your minimums less restrictive unless a significant positive event has occurred. However, it is okay to make your minimums more restrictive at any time. And never make your minimums less restrictive when you are planning a specific flight, or else external pressures will influence you. See Appendix D for example, Personal Minimums Checklist. Have a fun and safe flight. End of Appendix D. End of the Aviation Instructor's Handbook, FAA-H-8083-9A, by the U.S. Department of Transportation, Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, Flight Standards Service. Reader's Note. For the figures, tables, reference material, glossary, and index, the listener is referred to the public domain handbook available from the FAA.gov website, www.faa.gov/regulations_policies/handbooks_manuals/ Recording by Norman Elfer, Pearl River, Louisiana, USA.